the history that is taught to us, I do not think fundamentally it is not written for Indians. If I imagine it this way, always, that the way India's history is written is for some Tipu Sultan and his father Hyder Ali. They were in conflict with pretty much every kingdom that neighbored theirs. So Marathas, Travancore, British, everyone. And that is how they were at almost a constant struggle with the British.
So essentially, they were just trying to maintain their own supremacy as a kingdom, and they didn't mind fighting Indians, or British, anyone.
Completely, yes.
So they weren't really fighting for India or India's freedom. They were fighting for their own maintenance of power.
The people who have written history, whatever their biases may have been, the history that we studied, they wrote that history from the perspective of India fighting against the British. Because for the longest time, most of the history that we do study in schools and all that, the most interesting part is our freedom struggle. And there's a lot of people who actually do draw inspiration from people like Tipu Sultan to fight against pretty much everyone. But then this particular school of history writing portrays him as a freedom fighter because Tipu fought against the British. Now, we can go into why Tipu fought against the British, but long story short, we can say that Tipu Sultan and his father Hyder Ali, they were in conflict with pretty much every kingdom that neighbored theirs. So Marathas, Travancore, British, everyone. And that is how they were at almost a constant struggle with the British.
So essentially, they were just trying to maintain their own supremacy as a kingdom, and they didn't mind fighting Indians, or British, anyone.
Completely, yes.
So they weren't really fighting for India or India's freedom. They were fighting for their own maintenance of power.
This is a very interesting way of putting it. So let's break this particular down into two parts. First is they were not fighting for India, and the second part would be that they were fighting for their own. Let's go to the second part first. They were fighting for their own kingdom, which is evident by almost every letter that Tipu himself writes to everyone. Right? There's so many people he corresponds with for whatever state purposes he wants to do, and everywhere his idea is that he wants to expand his own kingdom and he wants to establish an Islamic kingdom. I don't have to make that statement. It is his own words. There are several letters. The book is available on the internet, and it's available for free as well.
It's a very short book, so if you want to know about the subject, I'm yet to read it, but I have started reading it thanks to Amogh. It's a very short book, less than 100 pages, so I encourage everyone to download it. You will provide a link.
Oh, sure, yeah. In fact, in one of his lectures, the author of this book, Mendele himself, encourages us to go and read the book. He in fact mentions that the book is available for free online. Yes. So, it's a short book, like she just said. Only 6 chapters, less than 100 pages. And the good thing about this book is that all citations are mentioned. So, for every statement made by the author, there are several instances of evidence which he is citing. So there's almost nothing in there that is concocted. There are a few places where he says that logically thinking this happened, and there are a few places where he does that, but then he clearly mentions that this is, logically speaking, this is what must have happened. Apart from that, the book is very well cited, and the reason the author has written a short version is that it should be more accessible to people, more people should read it. That is the idea. And just to continue the earlier question, there are multiple letters which we can see where he's talking to his people and saying that I want to establish an Islamic kingdom, and there's a lot of other things, I'm sure, very interesting things that you know, also quite interesting, that he wants to convert everyone to Islam. It doesn't matter if they're Hindu or they're Christians, because you have to remember that a lot of the coastal Karnataka region had a sizable Christian population. So that was his idea. And let's go to the first part, which was that he was not fighting for India. Right? The reason I call it an interesting way of looking at this question is because when we think about the idea of fighting for an India, we are implying, or rather it's an assumption, that there is an idea of India that people have in their mind, and then they're fighting for it. That idea of India it may not be said in so many words.
I mean, of course, Bharatvarsha has existed as in all languages across since millennia. So
Exactly.
that's not the idea that Tipu Sultan or Hyder Ali defeated.
Exactly. That is exactly the point that I was trying to make. And it is contrasted very well with Marathas, because Tipu's reign is what, 1782 to 1799, and like that's the last part of the 18th century, which was a time when Marathas dominated almost the entire landmass of the Indian subcontinent, maybe a few areas of northeast aside. But the Marathas had a very clear vision right since Chhatrapati Shivaji Maharaj that we want to establish a kingdom from the geographical boundaries that we talk about to Sindhu, and then they had an intention of capturing Delhi, which they in fact did succeed in doing.
Right. That's who the British took over Delhi from.
Yeah.
Right.
But that was not the conception that Tipu had in his mind. His idea was something completely else. In fact, maybe we'll talk about this later. There's a very interesting letter that Tipu wrote to Zaman Shah of Afghanistan, right? And he basically wanted to ally with him and take over the entirety of India and make it into an Islamic kingdom. That was the idea. So he was not fighting for India, definitely. Not a freedom fighter.
So you've been in Karnataka for a short while. I've been here longer, and there's Tipu Sultan's summer palace, Darya Daulat Bagh, is very close to Mysore. And we see that now, sort of through word of mouth or the legacy that it has, it comes across as a very suitable picnic spot for all of the Muslim families that are there in the area who were converted by Hyder Ali or Tipu Sultan. They find it an appropriate site to visit, and there is no mention of any sort of tyranny. And he has been celebrated as a freedom fighter, as a good king. In recent, Sher Mysore. In recent times, it's not obviously the older people would remember, but so what is your take on his portrayal? Is it a valid portrayal in some senses that he was a king, a legitimate king of Mysore?
Okay, so first let's tackle the legitimacy. Right, he was the ruler of the kingdom of Mysore. He inherited it from his father Hyder Ali. But Hyder Ali himself usurped it from the Wadiyar kings. So we can make a very good case that he was not the rightful ruler of the kingdom of Mysore.
I think the best way to do it is the Wadiyars are still kings of Mysore.
Oh yes.
They're still
but then there was a brief period where the British were able to defeat Tipu in the fourth Anglo-Mysore War, and they reinstated one of his heirs. Yeah. So I mean, this reinstatement aside, if someone usurps a throne, okay, he is a de facto king, but then that's not a rightful king. That at least from the perspective of
the subjects.
Yeah, the subjects, the people who live in the kingdom, they will obviously not see him as a favorable king. And okay, this factor also comes into play that neither Hyder Ali nor Tipu Sultan, especially not Tipu Sultan, they were not very interested in ruling the subjects in a fair manner. Their ideas were completely different. So there was no reason for the people of the kingdom of Mysore to feel as if Tipu was their king. Right. So this is by no means a legitimate king of the people. In fact, he was a tyrant, and there's so many examples to cite why he was a tyrant. I'm sure we'll get into it one by one.
Right. So the author, Gajanan Mehendale, he mentions the Canaries or the Kannadiga Christians, the Malabar warriors, the Kodagus. And being in Karnataka for so long, obviously you pick up on the history of the place. And it's very well known what he did with the Mandya Mayars, because the people there still do not celebrate Diwali because of the atrocities that Tipu unleashed on Diwali on these people. But I haven't read the book. So in terms of I think all of these are separate chapters.
Yeah.
So if you could tell us what specifically happened with the Kannada Christians in Tipu's reign.
Yeah. So a little bit of context here. So Tipu's reign was the latter part of the 18th century. And by this time, a large part of the coast of Karnataka, I think I mentioned this, a large part of the coast of Karnataka had a sizable Christian population. Right. And Tipu, in his zeal of converting everyone to Islam, and in his own words, he wanted to convert everyone to Islam, pretty much everyone. He had a, I'm not sure what to call it, but he had a disdain for Christians as well. And at one point he ordered his generals to invade the Christian territories, Colonise Christian territories, seize lands from everyone, and whoever were captured, he asked them to be sent to Srirangapatna, which was the capital. Now, we have to understand that being sent to Srirangapatna is essentially code for get them converted. And he doesn't even just say get them converted, because there's multiple ways in which, if you look at the letters, there's multiple ways in which people say convert them to Islam. They don't really directly say that. They say shine the light of Islam on them and things like that. But Tipu was also known for his abusive language. So he used to use really abusive terms, like you call them bastards, whoresons, and things like that.
Oh wow!
Yeah, I mean,
I did not know that.
yeah, I mean, this is the language that he uses, and for Christians as
If
well.
you could be clearer on the terms that you use.
Yeah, he called, like, in the book itself it is mentioned that he called them bastards and whoresons.
The
That's
Christians, specifically.
Yeah, Christians, and even sometimes he referred to Hindus in the same way. Meaning that he did not care much about the way in which he referred to them. In fact, he was abusive on purpose, for a reason. And one of the things he did was he asked for a lot for whoever was caught in his invasion of the territories of Canara, which is the northern part of coastal Karnataka.
Right.
He asked for them to be sent to Srirangapatna to be circumcised. Now that is a word that you will constantly come across in this book, is because I think it's a conscious choice on the author's part as well, author of this book, as well as Tipu's part. He wanted, at least the author wants us to know exactly what was happening to the people who were captured. Because now, if people choose to go for a circumcision for whatever reason, we have sophisticated tools, we have all sorts of anesthesia and all that. So it's a process where we don't really feel traumatized by that. But we're talking about a time when they were given a small draft of some sedative or something, which was not effective most of the time, and operations were performed willy-nilly, multiple people at a time. Several people died while undergoing all of this.
I remember there was, I think someone asked, it was Tipu Sultan that all of the collected foreskins should be sent or something.
I'm not sure, I have not come across that in this book, but there's a lot of other stuff which I still have to read. It could be because, well, I would not put this past Tipu Sultan. He is completely capable of doing things like this. And so there's multiple accounts of this happening, because how do we know this? There's multiple accounts of this happening. So there's several travelers from out of India who have also written about this. And when we talk about Christians, it's not just like native Christians, it's also people of England who were stationed in the Kingdom of Canada, or even in the Kingdom of Srirangapatna. One of the examples of the perversion of Tipu's mind is the way in which he treated captured European Christians. So at one point he ordered for capturing and of these European Christians and asked them to be sent to Srirangapatna for like multiple reasons. So one of them was to induct them into what he called his Chela battalion. Chela means, like we understand that now, that word now as student, but it kind of means slave.
Yeah.
So and he had an entire battalion.
No, I think we understand it as that. Sort of, yeah. Disciple.
Yeah. But it, that, because he is not exactly teaching them anything, so they are not disciples, they are slaves. But then he asked for them to be inducted into a Chela battalion, which would do guard duties or fight for him in wars and things like that. And apart from that, he also asked for, it's not a direct quote, but it's a paraphrasing, for younger and more handsome boys to be sent to Srirangapatnam to be trained in the arts of song and dance. Now we all know what that is code for. Young boys as young as 9 or 10 were captured and made to go through this. Of course, after circumcision. There was a thing that these slaves underwent. First, the painful act of circumcision with little to no, opium or other anesthetics. After that, their ears were pierced, and there's a ring along with one pearl or silver knob. The descriptions vary a little bit. They were made to wear that. That was a symbol of their slavery. So you could just look at someone and tell that they were slaves. That was the idea behind that. And that is what was done to a lot of people. So there are, like I mentioned, multiple accounts. And the numbers of the people who underwent this, Christians, mind you, who underwent this varies between 30,000 to 60,000. So imagine if this is just a variation of 30,000, the huge number of people who underwent this. And this is just the men who underwent this. Their families were also like sold as slaves. The women were given away as wives to his Abyssinian generals or guards or things like that. And kids were used as either soldiers in war or as dancing boys. And this, if I remember the date correctly, is around the June of 1784. And within a couple of months, he writes a letter in April or May, mentions the number 30,000, and maybe a couple of months down the line, he mentions another number, which is 40,000. He himself is mentioning this to one of his generals. I think Badruzzaman Khan is the one who he has written the letter to. And he himself mentions these numbers. So it's not like we are talking about these numbers and we've concocted out of thin air. That is the scale of which of the atrocities that Tipu conducted just on the Colonise Christians. That is the scale that we're talking about. It's not like this is forgotten, it's just that it somehow gets missed when we talk about Tipu. Well,
this is massive. It's on a scale which cannot get missed, so there's deliberate, cover up, it seems like. I am not going to be apologetic about using that because this is at a scale because the Christian population is not quite as much that this will be just an insignificant number.
It's interesting that you say that, the population bit. That's because before Tipu, Haidar was Haidar Ali, which is Tipu's father. He was also not as bigoted, but he was also bigoted. And he attacked pretty much every kingdom that neighbored him. And he was able to capture a few territories, added to the kingdom of Mysore after he usurped. And he tried to convert people, but he was not as zealous about it. But then there were factors like population in his mind, because his idea was he wanted to, he did not want to antagonize the Hindu population, which was the majority of the population. And his idea was, I want to rule, I want to keep my kingdom, I want to preserve my kingdom, and for that, whatever is needed, I will do. If I go in for conversions and there's a large-scale rebellion, he was not sure he could handle it. So there are reasons to call Haidar Ali slightly more tolerant than Tipu, which doesn't mean in the absolute sense he was tolerant. It's just that he, for practical reasons, did not indulge in large-scale conversions. Tipu had no qualms like that. Tipu was a zealous bigot from the beginning. And
I think this is the same difference that people make between Akbar and Aurangzeb.
Yeah. I mean, it's a similar thing actually. By the time, actually Akbar had quite a huge kingdom at his disposal. So it's not like he was going bankrupt or he could not muster up the military might to suppress rebellions. But for whatever his reasons are, he did not do the same thing that Aurangzeb did. Aurangzeb was a bigot right from the beginning, and he
Akbar did, like, you remember the cutting of the Brahmin shikhas and the Hindu skulls piled up and all that. Beard soaked in blood of Hindus.
So that I'm not sure.
Either him or one of his people. But anyway, he was until he realized that he would rather grow his kingdom and, for practical reason, create allies instead of being bigoted.
Antagonizing everyone.
Yeah, but Aurangzeb had no such qualms, and then he lost most of his share of the kingdom.
A slight example of this you can see, maybe we'll discuss this when we discuss about the Travancore kingdom a little bit more. The Mopla Muslims that we refer to as, the people we refer to as Mopla Muslims in Kerala, initially they were opposed to Tipu Sultan and they helped in one rebellion that happened in the Travancore region. I think they assisted the Nayars, if I'm not wrong. I have to refer to that. But they assisted the Nayars, but their reasons for doing it were economic. Because the invasions of Tipu and all of these kingdoms were devastating. And he levied very heavy taxes on his enemies. So that is what the Moplas were rising against. But then in a few years, circumstances changed and they turned and basically joined Tipu in his zeal. So that's a case of inversion. But initially, they did want to keep themselves away from Tipu's invasions. That was the idea.
Alright, so that was about the Cantonese Christians, and now the Kodagus and their war against Tipu.
Yeah. So it's a similar story when we talk about Kodagus, except Kodagus, the Kodagus.
So just a minute, sorry. I just want to address, because the Christians and Hindus are mentioned in his atrocities against them when, one of the means of doing that was when he tied them to the legs of elephants and had them dragged through the jungles and all of that. Was that in the coastal North?
It happened in Srirangapatnam.
Oh, okay.
But they were captured.
They were captured. When he said that send them to Srirangapatnam, so whoever did not convert was tortured.
Yeah. And similar fate actually happened to whoever were caught. The Nayars, for example, when they were fighting against Tipu. Many of them, they had basically ran away into the forest. So from there they could launch guerrilla attacks. And they were kind of successful for quite a while because it's difficult to win against a guerrilla style of warfare because the element of surprise is with the people who are attacking, right? So that's how Nayars fought for quite a while. But Tipu's army was too big, and the Nayars were not exactly equipped to fight with such big armies in pitched battles. And they also were running out of allies to rely on.
Sure.
That's what kept happening. And one of the atrocities that you were talking about, so one of the atrocities is tying people, and by people I mean men, women, both children. Tying them to elephants' feet and dragging them till the limbs fell off. And this is written as an order to one of his people by Tipu Sultan to do this. It's not like the Sibadar or the person in charge thought of this and he did it by himself. Tipu ordered these things to be happened. There's one letter, it's gruesome, but it's true. One of his letters to Badruzzaman Khan, he mentioned that Tipu's father, Hyder Ali, in 1776, he had invaded a kingdom. I can't remember which. I think it is Kodagu, but I can't remember exactly which one. So he had invaded that kingdom, and or it could be Bendur as well. And whoever was a prisoner of war from that kingdom, from that invasion, he ordered them to be hung by trees, and they were hung by tens of thousands.
Right, I remember reading that.
Yeah. And the letter, this is 1776, but in 1786, Tipu sends a letter to Badruzzaman Khan, and he mentions this to him. Tipu mentions this to him that 10 years ago, my father did this to these people who rebelled against our kingdom. Now, and he caught them. He hung them from the trees. Since then, the trees are waiting for more men. So whoever you find not complying to our demands of basically giving up land and converting to Islam, whoever you find not complying to these demands, you should do the same thing that my father did 10 years ago. To whoever you find. There's no way in which he makes a distinction between like the fighting like the soldiers and the civilian public. He does not make any sort of distinction. He said, whoever you find, you do this to them. Like it's an example of exactly how bigoted and cruel he could be.
Yeah, I don't think bigotry cuts it here.
Sorry?
I don't think bigotry cuts it here.
Oh yeah, I mean like that's the word that I can think of. I mean like
it's just plain insanely cruel.
Insanity.
So this is the person who is portrayed as a freedom fighter.
Yeah, because like I mentioned, the idea is to ignore all these parts because there's a chapter, if you read the book, then the 6th chapter deals with falsification of history.
I see.
Right. I'm sure we'll discuss that in detail, but there's several examples where people just try to omit that part where he displays his bigotry and focus more on the part where he fights the British, because there are like 4 Anglo-Maratha wars, out of which I think 3 were fought by Tipu, or maybe 2 were fought by Tipu.
No, so here's the thing. Even the framing of the Anglo-Maratha wars is not an Indian framing because he's had multiple wars, and we don't discuss those wars as something as well documented or well historicized by these people as the what do you say, the Mysore Wars or the Sharia or Tipu Malabar wars. We don't discuss them like that.
Yeah.
So even because I'm sure that the scale was quite similar, because the British were yes, they were in power, but you can't tell me that the Marathas were.
No, the Marathas were in fact stronger than the British were in the 18th century,
yes.
right? Because they held more territories. They were the ones who won a lot of the northern parts of
For
India.
example, the Nair Tipu war, like I don't know the Nair Mysore war, even if you don't want to mention Tipu as such. But there's no framing. It just struck me when you're saying that the Anglo, because we've seen that he has fought everyone, and yet we discuss those 4 wars where he fought the British.
Yeah.
That framework isn't there.
Yeah. Now this is my personal opinion, what I'm about to say. There's a thing that people say, right? The victor writes the history.
Did the British win?
No, but the thing is, in time, British came to be the people who ruled the entire subcontinent, right? And they obviously wrote the history that they were more interested in.
No, I think this is incorrect, because that way, we've had the Marathas also documenting their wins. We've had the Travancore. We have the Mysore king commissioning so much historical work. So this is just the bias of those who don't have textbooks post-independence.
That's what I'm trying to
then it's like the British won.
Exactly, that's what I'm trying to say. So the framing happens because the people who are more interested in documenting their victories end up writing more. So the thing is, I'm sure that Tipu has, I'm not sure if he commissioned history, because there's a part where the author discusses the books that Tipu commissioned to be written in his time. But most of those are, there's one book where he says, write my victories down. So there's a Fatah something.
Hagiographic account.
Yeah, hagiographic accounts, basically talking about his own victories over the different peoples that he fought against. And then some of them were to do with like religious texts and things like that. Those he commissioned. But they are present. What happens is, whoever ends up writing like a history of the entire region, I'm guessing that they consider these conflicts as not as important. I'm not sure why, for whatever biases they may have.
Is there a difference in scale?
Well, difference in scale as in, we already discussed the numbers that for this one, Tipu against Christians, it's like 30,000-40,000.
Absolutely.
And at one point, he when he invaded Travancore as well as the Colonise, even those numbers, the numbers of people that he converted, they're like 50,000, 60,000, 70,000. There's different accounts.
So the fighters were exponentially more.
Yeah, the fighters were many more.
So there's no reason to do that. There's no reason to have only an account of Anglo. This is something I haven't actually come across. Like, this is a bias that is not discussed. That the framing is Tipu against British only. There is no other framing where Tipu against other kingdoms is even discussed or.
Yeah, and the thing that happens is, it's not like people have not written about what Tipu really was. They have. But the thing is, it fails to find traction for whatever reason. Maybe people like you and me who are interested in this side of history, maybe we don't exist in that big numbers. Because what you have to remember...
we are just a platform, right? It's not like there were so many of the Marxist scholars either. They had a platform.
Yeah, so they were in institutional power.
Right.
That is what creates a big difference. Now, whenever the inversion of that happens, if at all it does, it will happen. But till that time, the thing is, more primary research is needed. So what I have done is just secondary research. Someone has done the effort, they've written a book, which is a very small book, and it's not like I'm relying only on that one particular book. What I tried to do was try to contextualize it in different ways. So the way people here, political parties have tried to use it, the way people in Maharashtra talk about Hyder Ali, because Marathas have been come in contact with, come into conflict with Mysore multiple times. So there is that perspective as well. What we do need is more primary research and definitely much more secondary work. Because again, these books are detailed and it requires a certain amount of interest to go through all of this, because it may sound boring, because the same account is written by, say, Francis Buchanan, then same account is written by James Perry, same account is written by someone else, same account is by...
So they create those citation loops that are then used by...
No, I'm talking about the history of Tipu.
Yes, so what I'm saying is that these are the loops that these cite each other and then they can be used in history textbooks for a colonized nation like ours.
Exactly. The point I was trying to get at is because there's so many different things, and the reference of all of this is used in this book. So it may get a little bit boring, but what can help make it interesting is people read more and more about this, and then they try to explore each aspect on their own and write individual stories. Like there could be an entire book on what Tipu did with the Kodams. I mean, you mentioned that there's a section of people, I think in Mandam, people, they don't celebrate Diwali because on the day of Diwali there were huge atrocities. Right? So there could be an entire account of this, and mind you, none of this has to be exaggerated.
Exactly.
The history that has taken place itself is so brutal that, I mean, reading it is. There's a thing, I think you mentioned in the beginning of our discussion that you had been to Mysore and Srinagar, you've seen those places, right? But in my course of reading this book, I don't know, it's a part of my, the way I think about things, but I have developed a strong, not exactly hatred, but an aversion to the city itself now. I don't know, I know it's unfair of me to
it
think
also
that.
has the Srinagar Swami river, which kind of forms the heart of the place.
Exactly.
It's very lovely, but it has good vibes.
Yeah.
Despite those atrocities, Srinagar actually has good vibes. So does Mysore. I think the legacy of the warriors is much stronger than what, despite his brutality towards its people, the people retained their very old paths. You know, we are divinely blessed or something, at least in certain parts, because it still has good. There's the Triveni Sangam there as well. It's a different Triveni than what you have in Allahabad. It's small, it's drying up, but places with, it's good.
Yeah, I mean, I don't want to
you
say that.
You should go there, but at least Darya Daulat Bagh, I agree that it's not, I will tell you, it is not so much that the brutality does not come through, but the apathy that our own people have. I've seen so many Christians, now that we've discussed what has happened to the Christians, I've seen so many Christians, especially from Kerala, both these places, right, northern Karnataka coast as well as Kerala, the coast of Kerala. They have experienced the Tipu's atrocities firsthand, and they retain no memory of it, or they are either in some post-traumatic disorder where they've decided to move past the trauma and they visit the place with no previous knowledge of it. And it's.
I mean, you see similar tendencies. Yeah, you see similar tendencies elsewhere. Now, my hometown is a town called Nanded in Maharashtra. It's close to Hyderabad, right? I mentioned this because there's a similar, not exactly along the lines of Tipu Sultan, but very similar story that happened in the kingdom of Hyderabad, which was ruled by the Nizam. His atrocities on the non-Muslims of his region were also like pretty prolonged, in fact, I would say. Over 7 generations. There's a long history there. In fact, I've written about it. But then what we see happening is, over time, people, and especially towards the reign of the last Nizam, there were quite a few atrocities by the 6th and the 7th Nizam. But what we see happening is people tend to, I don't know, forget, I don't want to call it forgetting that history, but they're trying to get past the history by not mentioning it again. They're reticent about it. They don't want to talk about it. Yeah, that could be the thing. I thought of that because you mentioned like a post-traumatic way of coping with what has happened.
Right, like I saw them in person going in without any, and then the guards do not really stress on these issues at all. It's more about how the palace is built. When I say guards, I mean the guides there. They don't stress on any of it. And most of the tourists, I think a lot of the tourists are Muslims as well, so I'm not sure if that will cause an issue. But there is very little mention of the atrocities. It's a very, here, this is how he is dressed, these are the coins he issued, these are the paintings he commissioned, this is the style of the painting on the walls, the mosaics, and things like that. It's a wooden palace, and you can actually touch everything. I'm not sure it's very well protected either. I'm not sure it should be also. But then it's people go into it completely unaware. I was very glad to see that it's one person's mind because I showed up these are the articles about the Manya Mayas and all of that. Of course, it must be seen, but it must be seen in its complete context. Yes.
Yeah, because that is what ultimately will tell you about what history this place has.
So, it must be seen in its complete context. But this apathy towards Indian history as such, but not towards say the history of the colonizers or the history of invaders or the history of those who were converted to a certain ideology but refused to be Indian anymore. It's very unique to India.
Really? Because we see this in a lot of places. So I think now what leads to this has multiple reasons, obviously. So the way the history is taught to us, the way the history is written in the first place. So I had heard someone mention this in some podcast that I had heard that throughout school, at least till the middle school, history should be about nation building. The focus of history, obviously, it should not repeat falsehoods. That's not what I'm saying. But what I'm saying is, in order for there to be like a grounding in your native culture and your native history, you need to be told what builds your nation.
But that's always been the point of history.
Yeah, but do we see that?
So, for example, in Britain, they still speak of Winston Churchill as a hero.
Yeah.
So, if you kill white guys, you're a problem. If you kill non-white people, you're a good guy.
Fine, huh? Yeah, I mean, that's what happens in Britain, but
Doctor Who had an episode and it was very rankling to me as an Indian, and in hindsight, I'm very problematic episodes, but I liked the show. But then it's very commonplace to see Churchill, and this is not the only. So if I say this, any European or British person will just say, "So you think Hitler was not evil?" That's not the point. The context that you have is only of Europe.
Yeah, exactly.
But the fact is that it affected the rest of the world. That does not compute. The rest of the world that is non-white does not compute to anyone who is. But to the population that is also non-white, that is Indian. Even there it does not compute.
Yeah, and partly the reason is that the history that is taught to us, I do not think fundamentally it is not written for Indians. If I imagine it this way, always, that the way India's history is written is for some outsider to read it and get an idea of what India is like. Outsider to read it and get an idea of what India is like.
It's an outside-in perspective.
Yeah, an outside-in perspective. That's my view about it. Because if you were teaching history to your own kids or younger people that we really care about, then I would not start it in that way. Because the way you would do it is, you would start with people of your. First of all, it should be limited by region. I understand that having one single board over the entire country, like we have for CBSE, for example, there's limitations to how many people you can put because everyone has different regional history, which is very important. But then the role of regional history is to tell them about exactly what makes your culture, regionally speaking, right? And then it should build up into the broader, how it fits into the broader country system. Of course, you have to talk about the history of independence of India, but the way I see it, a large part of discussion in the popular culture or even in like social media and all that, it's lopsided in favor of the history of India's independence.
But that's also from a particular narrative perspective.
Yeah, definitely.
Also, it ignores the millennia of history that we had before the British.
Exactly. So it's like the be-all and all of India is when the British came, we fought against them, the British went back, and that's all. That's not how it is supposed to be. In fact, I was listening to one talk by, I think, Dr. Meenakshi Jain.
Oh.
And I mean, she's like a brilliant body of work. And she mentioned somewhere that in one of the history books that she ended up seeing, CBSE history books, I think 11th and 12th, something like that, the Chola's history and some Ghori or someone's history, it was just compressed into one single page.
And I've read those paragraphs myself. You have the Rashtrakutas, the Pallava, they can answer Rashtrakutas, Pallavas,
Cholas and all that.
Cholas, you have the Chalukyas, the Hoysalas.
So many people.
Everything is crammed into Vijayanagara Empire, you have Chola Empire, and then you forget the rest.
Exactly. If you just talk about the Chola Empire, they've been there for more than 1500 years. They've been ruling. And you basically kept them confined into like a couple of paragraphs, one page, maybe. That's not how your history is supposed to be taught. That is what leads to memes like when, if you remember, there's a meme of Rahul Gandhi talking to Kamala Hassan, and Kamala Hassan says to Rahul Gandhi that the Cholas were not Hindu. And Rahul Gandhi asked, because that was a narrative that was going around, and Rahul Gandhi asks him, what about Bhattiwas? Right, so that was the meme. Yeah, but the meme came into being because the topic under discussion was that Cholas were not Hindu. Now, this sort of stupid narrative, I want to use this word, stupid narrative, is because you don't have any semblance of what Cholas stand for. The greatest kings of Cholas, they established a place called Gangaikonda Cholapuram. What does that mean? You're bringing the water from Ganga to your place.
It's not just here, by the way. Mauritius, they have who they consider the 13th Jyotirlinga, Mauritiusvara.
Yeah.
So there you have almost a Gangaikonda, which is a pond that's filled with Ganga water.
Oh, I see.
And then the rest of the lakes, etc., it just falls into the Ganga. So they consider that the Ganga. They use that Ganga Jal. Imagine that's in Mauritius.
Yeah. I mean, I think Mauritius is the third country which has a Hindu majority after India and Nepal. I think Mauritius is that. But the point I was trying to make is when you don't contextualize your history properly like this is what the discourse becomes. Cholas were not Hindu. Who would say that? And that's such a stupid statement to make.
But it's believed by so many. It's a fault of lack of institution that you allow stupidity to ferment.
Yeah. I mean, it's not just allow stupidity to ferment. In fact, through, I don't know by design or whatever, by design I mean by design showing less of a Hindu kingdom that ruled for so long, or by just not portraying them as important people, who they were, extremely important. This is done by the institution. It's not just that they allowed it to happen, they did it. So when a history is commissioned to be written, you want it to contain aspects of all time periods and of all regions. When you ignore that, when there's a thing, I don't remember who said this, but it was about history without dates, something like that. So there were no dates mentioned. I think it was one of the interviews that I heard of, I think S.L. Bhairappa. He mentioned that he was on one of the panels of CBSE to maybe review the texts of history books that were being written. And the list of things that they were asked, like list of things that they were told that please follow these guidelines. And one of those things were don't rely on dates or something like that, if my memory serves me correct. So that was one of those, rely on dates as in don't mention too many dates. Things like that. So once you do that, you fail to contextualize anything correctly. Well, if you get rid of details.
I think dates were very hard to remember. But for example, the scale 1500 years of Chola Empire versus what?
150
years of Mughals and 200 years of the British. But also, actually, some of the major facts that are missing is that it's portrayed as if we had a Mughal empire, which was basically Delhi and surrounding places. and then you have the British. The Marathas, which were the biggest kingdom, they were concurrent. They existed at the same time. That's who the British took over from. Nobody knows this. If you go outside, ask today's school children, ask the adults. They will tell you that it was from the Mughals.
Yeah, because that's the way it is portrayed. Because, so there's this thing about the Mughal Empire that you mentioned. It was an empire. In some during some times, maybe during Akbar's reign, the expanse was quite big. During Aurangzeb's reign, the expanse was quite big.
But the Lodhis are mentioned before that.
Yeah, and the Lodhis inherited an anyway decaying empire, and they just lost it when Babur invaded. But what happens is, during Aurangzeb's reign, for the last 25 years of his life, he comes to the Deccan. He wants to capture the Maratha kingdom. He fails spectacularly. And after that, what happens is the empire becomes so weak that Marathas just pick up the pieces.
But even with the Akbar thing, right? You had Maharana Pratap shown as losing the battle of Haldighati. Whereas that's how it's shown.
Yeah. I mean,
this is something that Akbar himself acknowledges, that this is the greatest warrior I've ever met, and he wins the third battle.
Yeah, there could be, entire libraries filled with just material that shows that this history is falsified. It's so much, because just in this book, the Tipu as he really was, there's an entire chapter where things are mentioned. Okay, so let me, I don't have the quote with me, it's on my phone. There's a quote where one of his biographers, I think his name is Mohibul Hassan, biographer of Tipu, like a 20th century biographer of Tipu. He writes about Tipu's zeal to wage jihad against colonials or something like that. That is the word that he mentions. And then he goes on to say that Tipu's jihad against these colonials in some way ties into the independence that he wanted for Mysore kingdom from the British. That is how he couches it.
Correlate to the
Exactly. The way Tipu writes it is, this is my jihad against infidels. Whenever he mentions this, he mentions that his jihad is against infidels. Now, be it Christians or be it Hindus, doesn't matter. But against infidels. The way a alleged historian writes it is jihad against colonials. I don't know how someone makes that mistake, if it's a mistake.
It's not a mistake. I mean, you cannot, both words are English, right? You have infidels and you have colonialists.
Exactly.
There is no way that
There's no way. Exactly. I mean, you have to have a bias to read a Persian text, because my assumption is that the historian Muhibbul Hasan, he must be well versed in Persian. So he must have read the manuscript himself, the surviving thing, and he must have done a translation. That is my assumption that he has done it. Could be that he has just read multiple translations of earlier works and done that. But if he has read Persian, then there's no way that he comes across a word like jihad against kafirs or something like that, and he translates it as colonial. Because it doesn't make sense in any word. No,
I've read such mistranslations. Yeah. For example, I know enough Sanskrit to read Shudra. It's written. The English translation read the lowest of the Brahmins.
Really? That's mischief. That's clearly mischief. It's done on purpose. I can cite another example.
Devdutt Patnaik broke up a word, and it's a bay something.
Oh, I think that is the word that comes to mind when he had.
No, he had written about my Gita. I started reading. Look, I had no idea about who he was at that time. I read him as someone who was bringing about Indian history. This was ages ago, when my friend had a copy of my Gita. I started reading it, and I speak Gujarati, understand it, and all that. So it broke a word. I remember the first part was bay, and the second part was Sanskrit. Basically, it was a Sanskrit word that he broke up into bay and whatever it was prefix to. And he translated bay as two, which is in Gujarati, and the rest in Hindi. So
Devdutt Patnaik has many other problems.
By the way, no, of course, the personality we wouldn't go into. Alright, I think I am causing you to believe it's quite a bit. Yeah. But we were talking about the 6th chapter about falsifying history. Yeah. But before that, let's also discuss the Kodagu Kingdom and then the Malabar coastal wars against Tipu.
Yeah. So the Kodagu Kingdom as well as the Malabar Kingdom, both of them were invaded by Tipu, and similar orders were issued to his generals fighting over there, his Risaldas, his Sibadas and all of that. Broadly speaking, the orders were like this: to confiscate all the lands of the natives over there. Whoever runs there, temporarily they are out of his grasp. So whoever is fighting with you and all that, you confiscate all of their lands. Whoever agrees to be converted, that is circumcised, he gives them their land back with all the privileges that come with being a Muslim in an Islamic state. Those who refuse to convert, if they are caught, they are hanged, or some people were forcefully converted. That was also one of the things that he enjoyed, forcefully converted.
What does that mean?
Meaning that there are instances which are cited in the book where he captured some Nayars as well, who were fighting against him. Some of them were captured alive, and he gave them a choice to convert of their own will, or they will be forcefully converted, which means that they'll be obviously taken to Srirangapatnam and they'll be held down, made to drink the drafts and all that, and that doesn't end it. One of the things that he did with these forceful converts, because there were a lot of forceful converts as well, who did not consent to be circumcised. What he did was he performed a forceful circumcision on them, got it performed, and then he deputed them to serve in his army in places which were far from their native place. He did that with a lot of people. In fact, there's a letter written by one of his, I'm not sure if it's a letter or it's a report or something, written by one of the officials, like revenue officials of Tipu Sultan after his death in some 1800 or something. And he remembers Tipu's time as a time when the revenues never matched the salaries or the total expenditure of the kingdom, salaries of the soldiers, to buy whatever was needed to keep the soldiers keep all the supplies to the soldiers maintained and all of that. Revenues never matched. So he was always, the difference came from the state coffers. So he was almost always running at a loss. That's what the revenue administrator says. And the reason I mention this is because a large part of the kingdoms that he invaded, Kodagu and Malabar, but I think Travancore as well. But Travancore fought back hard, and they managed to keep themselves secure for a longer time. But for Malabar and Kodagu, what he did was he captured large parts of the population, and for whatever reason, he thought that sending like tens of thousands of people from their native place to somewhere else to serve in their army, and getting Muslims from different regions, like who were, I don't know what to call them, like older Muslims who were not converted, who were Muslims, to go and settle in those areas and start cultivating. Basically emptying the land of natives and planting his own...
resettling, changing. So the demographic change thing was something that he had thought about and strategized.
Yeah, he experimented it.
Wow.
That's how it, like even if you read the book, that's how his own people talk about it. It was
social engineering through demographic change.
Yeah, and it failed miserably.
Oh, it failed.
Yeah, because first of all, it failed in two aspects. First is that the people who were settled in the emptied areas, they could not keep up the agriculture, because obviously the place that they were from was very different from the place that they were made to go. The soil was different, the climate was different, the other living conditions were completely different. So it was difficult for them to survive over there, much less be able to cultivate the land in the same way that the early people did. So the revenue went down over there. Several people died, several people asked to return to the place that they were from. Some were also allowed to do that. And the second way in which that experiment failed is that the people who were emptied from there, so the natives of that place, so natives of Malabar, wherever they were posted, a lot of people died there because they were used to the conditions of Malabar, and when they were posted to places that were different from there, they died of the climate, the difference in climate. They died of diseases. They died in during the process of circumcision. There was a lot of death that was wanton. Like if someone dies in war, at least they're serving in the war. But if you die of just disease, then you just end up doing nothing. That is what has happened with the population of Malabar and of Kodagu. This is what has happened. So I mean, it's impossible for us to imagine the kind of loss he has, like the kind of damage he has done to these kingdoms. Demography is like, we now think about it in terms of like, if outsiders come, like we talk about it in terms of Assam or West Bengal, people from outside of those regions are coming, they're changing the culture and all of that. This is what the discussion goes on now. But imagine 200 years ago, and a ruler of the Mysore region actually performed an experiment like this. Now he was able to do this because he was a tyrant. He could enforce basically anything that he wanted to. And he enforced this, the experiment failed. It failed miserably. And he doesn't regret anything, obviously, because whatever letter he writes, he first of all, he doesn't mention about any of this. And he keeps on insisting about his to convert everyone to Islam. He doesn't improve his ways. Like, okay, this doesn't work, so maybe let me try something else. No, doesn't happen. Letter after letter, he keeps talking about the same thing. He warns people repeatedly that you have rebelled against me 6 times. If you do it the 7th time, I will convert every one of you. I will shine the light of Islam on everyone. That's what he keeps saying. There's a letter. There's a letter directly written like this. Yeah.
Okay. So this is a person who also asked, the Afghans, the Turks, to come and colonize India.
Yeah. So this goes into our earlier discussion. I think we spoke about how the idea of India that the Marathas had, and the idea of his own kingdom that Tipu had. So the difference comes into the picture when I think it was 1780s itself. I don't remember the exact date, but he had sent a letter to Zaman Shah of Afghanistan, who happens to be the grandson of Ahmad Shah Abdal. He asks Zaman Shah to invade India from north because Tipu also harbors a grudge against Marathas. And by this time, 1780s, 1790s, Marathas are very strong.
Yes.
They are the ones who are de facto rulers of Delhi. Essentially, the Mughal Sultanate is placed under the protection of Marathas. Right. So he asks the Afghan Shah to attack Delhi, unseat Marathas from there. And he mentions that then you start from the north, I will start from the south, and whatever Maratha pretensions exist in the Deccan, we'll finish them off and we'll divide the kingdom between ourselves and establish an Islamic state. That was his intention. ultimately didn't materialize because I think Persians attacked Afghanistan, so Zaman Shah could not send help. But in fact, he had also at one point written to the Sultan of Ottoman Turkey, asking for his help. And it in fact, is a very interesting aspect of Tipu's perverse personality, that we can see what happens when he sends his messengers to Istanbul. He asks for the Ottoman Sultan's help in defeating the British and whatever his enemies, whoever they were. Ottomans don't help him because they don't want to antagonize the British. It's a different matter. But the convoy that he sent to Constantinople, he said that when you go there, you give this letter and all of that to him. This is all captured in the letter. There's a reference of that in this book as well. So he mentions that when you are there, by 12 or 20, I can't remember, boys between the age of 10 and something to work as dancing boys. Eunuchs, maybe not boys, maybe eunuchs or boys, something like that. He mentions this to the convoy that is going there on a diplomatic mission to buy these many eunuchs or young boys for the palace in Srirangapatnam to serve as dancing boys. Now, we know what dancing boys mean. It's unimaginably perverted what Tipu Sultan thought about young boys or like women of Hindu kings, like women as in sisters and wives of Hindu kings or even the general population. You cannot imagine.
I think it says that any handsome Hindu women you get you. That's general war booty sort of.
Yeah, I mean, just to mention the scale at which he has done this. There's a mention by, I think, Francis Buchanan, who's a Britisher of that time. He mentions that the Zanan Khana of Tipu Sultan had 601 women. Some 333 of those were Tipu's own wives, concubines, and attendants, and the remaining were his father's. He had 80 wives of his own, wives and concubines of his own, who were in that. Almost all of those were born Hindu. At some point, their fathers or husbands or brothers, they were captured and either circumcised or killed or hanged or dragged on the ground by tying them to elephants' feet, whatever, like unimaginable cruelty. And then the women were essentially put into the Zanan Khana. This is the scale at which we are talking about Tipu's personality. This is what happens. And in fact, there's an example where, I don't know if I've mentioned this till now, there's a time when he attacks the Colonise Christians. He also orders for European boys to be captured, European Christians to be captured. And among those European Christians, there are a few boys between the age of 10 and something. And those boys, he asks for those boys to be trained in the arts of song and dance and be used as dancing boys in his court. There's letters to this effect. He himself has asked for this to be done. So the perversion is unimaginable. And see, this is why I think I mentioned that there's an image of Srirangapatnam in my head, which makes me averse to that city. I know it is no fault of that city and it's unfair of me to do that.
I think the soul of the city is not ruined by what he's done. It's that
I'm sure.
I've been to places where it is, and this did not feel like that.
Yeah, I'm sure. See, I understand that it is unfair of me to think like that, but when you keep reading...
I know, so I hope that the audience also feels as rageful towards the writers of such history as well as Tipu Sultan himself. And I urge you to please read this book, which, the author himself requests that it's free. It's very short, it's well written. I did skim through it and I will complete reading it shortly. But I hope that what you've said induces some amount of rage. I think this is not entertainment. I don't.
Definitely not entertainment.
Education can be channeled towards better, necessary feelings. So I hope that.
So my perspective on this, if at all someone wants to hear that, is that when we talk about contextualizing your own history, unless you know the scale at which your the damage to your culture has been done, wherever it has been done, or basically, unless we understand what exactly has happened, we cannot really hope for understanding the way the society has formed itself into now. Right. So it is essential for us to have an understanding of history. For that, in my perspective, it does not help to look the other way. You have to read. You have to know exactly what has happened. You have to know the tendencies of the people who have done this. It's said that history keeps repeating itself unless we, in fact, the saying goes like, if you don't learn from history, it repeats. I think it repeats anyway. May not be in the same scale, but because human tendencies never really go away. Same tendencies exist in people. What we need to do is we need to know what has happened in the past, so that when we see these tendencies, we're able to tackle them appropriately. That is my point. So we need to read this history. And like you mentioned, I don't want people to read this as as an entertainment or something like that, because these aspects of history are, first of all, they were written in a very distorted manner when they were taught to us. And the people who go and make all these efforts to dig up the real history, they correct it in a very meticulous manner, as Dr. Mehendale has done. And when they present things like this in front of us, I think we need to treat it with respect, and we need to understand the seriousness with which they have written this. That would be my request to whoever listens to this and decides to read.
Thank you so much for joining me today, Amogh. And I hope we do a few more such